Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our program, Connecting Memories, with Marca Daley from the Eastham Historical Society, as well as Lou Andujar, local veteran. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm Marca Daley, born and raised in Eastham, and from a family of veterans, and you'll hear about some of them a little bit later on. But I've been asked to do a history of Eastham's veterans, and I thought I would do this through a virtual tour of our Historical Society Museum, the 1869 museum, because we have a few newish, the last 2 years, veterans exhibits there, plus several displays that we put up for this past Veterans Day. So, it's November, and when I think of November, I think of veterans and I think of giving thanks. And at the Schoolhouse Museum, we created new displays to complement the Veterans Day ceremony at the new Veterans Memorial. And then being asked to speak here today, I thought we would incorporate them, as I said. So I'm going to show you an outline of today's topic so you can kind of judge where we are as we go along. The historical background and context of the schoolhouse and the Schoolhouse Museum and its history and its exhibits. And then I will get to the veterans exhibits of the 18th and 19th centuries. The special Veterans Day exhibits that we did for November 11th this year, which includes some honor rolls and veterans who shared their memories and who are remembered by us, and the Veterans Memorial Monument, which Lou Andujar, my sidekick here, will explain what inspired it, how it was established, and when it was dedicated. So that's today's program. The historical context and background of the Schoolhouse Museum. It was built in about 1869, and it went from a one-room schoolhouse to a three-room by the early 1900s. In 1936, a new school was built just down the road. And in 1937, on February 1st, the children marched out, books in their arms and led by their marching band, and they walked the 1/4 of a mile down to the new schoolhouse. Now, how do I know this? I'm the archivist at the schoolhouse, but this was not in the archives except for some photos. Any guesses?
You marched?
My mom marched. My uncle marched. Loads of my school classmates' parents marched. And it was one of their most exciting memories of their childhood. We always heard about it. So the school was used for different, a young couple lived in one of the wings. One of the wings was used for lumber. The other one was kind of moved away. But by 1963, it was in quite a bit of disrepair. And the newly formed Eastham Historical Society raised funds to renovate it. And in 1965, it opened to the public as a museum, the one-room schoolhouse. In the early 2000s, the society raised more funds and restored one of its previous wings. There were 3. And so in 2007, the new museum opened. So we have 2 rooms, and I should have moved the slide forward when I explained all of that. So we had the 19th century photo of the schoolhouse, treeless, looking all the way over to the ocean. The mid-20th century, this center photo is when the Historical Society had bought it. That's the disrepair it was in. And the 21st century, this was taken a couple years ago, just before COVID, but it looks very much the same now. So the schoolroom is on your left, and the desks are there, and it acts as a schoolroom, and kids coming in, especially on rainy days in the summer, love to play schoolhouse, and we allow that. They can use the books in the room, they can use the slates that are on the desk, they can do everything. The newer museum room, has all of Eastham's history. And I'll tell you a few of I'm trying to entice you to our museum. I'll tell you a few of the exhibits. We have the First Peoples exhibit, the Wampanoags and the Nausetts. We have the arrival of the Mayflower and when the Pilgrims came over. The Captain Penniman family exhibit. There's an exhibit of 18th, 19th, and 20th century dolls and children's toys. The Henry Beston and the Outermost House exhibit. The Ship's Wheel Corner, where we focus on shipwrecks and life at sea. The life-saving exhibit for the lifesavers, which were so vital to Eastham. The Historic Eastham Homes exhibit, which is a new one this year also. Eastham's transportation. Did you all know we had 2 railroad stations and an airport in Eastham? Yes, and you can come to the museum and learn about them. We have school photos and memorabilia, and as I said in the very beginning, the most recent Eastham veterans in the 3 early wars. So on to the veterans exhibits. I want you to focus on this drawing by Jim Owens. It's at the top of a list of Revolutionary War soldiers. And I'll mention something about it later if you don't notice it before I get there. So, the book, I'll be mentioning the sources that I used throughout this talk because I think it's important to let you know where I find my information in the archives and in our sources. Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolutionary War was published in 1908, and it's really a wonderful resource. And it provided details of each town on the Cape's militia, all of Massachusetts actually, their engagements in the war, and this is where we found all of the military information for Eastham, as well as for Captain Solomon Higgins, and he's the first veteran that I'll speak of today. There was no standing army. It was local militias that were formed by towns and counties who joined together to fight for the cause of American independence. And the Cape had several militia groups led by local men. Captain Solomon Higgins, who I have his parents and who he married here just for the Eastham connection, because they're all Eastham connections, and you will recognize many of the names, I think. So he was born on July 4th, which is rather serendipitous. He had 9 siblings. He was the son of Solomon and Bethiah Chase Higgins. He married 3 times. Abigail Twining, he had 4 children. Then he married her sister Mary Twining. She died within a couple of years, and he married Temperance Smith and had another 5 children, so 9 altogether. These are some of the engagements that Eastham's militiamen were involved in, and this is the list of Eastham's Revolutionary War soldiers. It's not a complete list, I wish it were, but it was created by Jim Owens. And have any of you noticed anything about the list yet and the figures on it? Did any of you know Jim? He was a longtime Eastham resident, EHS member, artist, teacher, historian. He also did after-school detention at the high school, which we loved to go to because it was in the art room where he was teaching, and he just yacked to us the whole time if we ever spent any time down there. Jim had a penchant for placing himself in his sketches. So if you look very carefully, I'll go back. The guy in front, that's Jim, self-portrait. And he's in many of the things that we find in the archives. But here are Eastham's. So the engagements, have you heard of any of these? Defense of the Seacoast, Fort Ticonderoga, the secret expedition to Rhode Island, Falmouth and Bedford, and the wreck of the Somerset? Any of those sound familiar? A couple.
Fort Ticonderoga.
Ticonderoga. Okay, well, I will enlighten you, all thanks to our history books and the archives. And I loved putting these exhibits together because I just learned so much myself about Eastham and its involvement in the early wars. So the men in the early militias signed up for 6-month periods. They signed up from July through December, 1776, 1777. From December through July, I'm not sure what they did, but those were their terms of service. And Eastham and Truro militias worked together in defense of the seacoast because the British came ashore with impunity to raid the farms, take the crops, take the livestock, and they also had an embargo on any schooners or packets or boats that the men of the townspeople would have, and they were a much larger force. So they were difficult times, and the Truro and Eastham men in particular worked to keep those soldiers from coming on. I don't know how they did it because they were vastly outnumbered, but as you'll hear later, Mother Nature sometimes came to their aid. Fort Ticonderoga is, I remember, that an Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, and we all learned that. Well, this is post-Ethan Allen. Fort Ticonderoga has been taken back from the British, and it's winter time. And I want to see, Colonel Henry Knox organized a plan to move all the artillery and heavy guns from Ticonderoga up in Vermont to Boston on the hills of Dorchester and Bunker Hill to keep the British from coming ashore. So how did they do it? It's a long way.
Oh.
No, because of the embargo. It was winter. We had lots of snow and freezing weather back then. And what they did was they used sleds, heavy sleds, and they moved the guns over the frozen rivers and the snow-covered Berkshires, crossed the state to Boston, and mounted on Dorchester Heights, the guns from Fort Ticonderoga actually compelled the British to evacuate the city of Boston in March of '76. I thought that was pretty clever. There's also a story of Solomon Higgins and another gentleman, Isaac Snow, who helped build defenses and to make the British think that there were more people there than soldiers there than there were. They cut down bushes and they wrapped them in bundles and they stood them up so it just from afar looked like all kinds of people standing up on the ramparts, but they weren't. It reminds me of burning wood in Macbeth. The secret expedition to Rhode Island was very long and involved, and I won't make it long and involved for you, but suffice to say, the British troops had occupied Newport Island, and General Washington decided that the British troops should be removed. They had to get rid of them. So his general, and I don't recall his name, decided they could do it in the dead of night. So one half of Rhode Island's militia and members from Massachusetts and Connecticut militias were mobilized, trained, and stationed in the town of Tiverton, Rhode Island, by a stone bridge, was the detail. This was in September. It was a 31-day expedition. And what they were going to do was get boats or build boats, sneak in the dead of night, take the British by surprise at Newport, and get rid of them. They had a force of 10,000 men. But there were many delays, mostly caused by the weather. And it was nearly October before they were ready to attack. And again, the weather was against them. And a storm battered their boats and wrecked not only the boats, but their plans for a surprise attack. Somehow, because of this, the British got word of it, and they had to end up, besides about 5,000 of their 10,000 had decided to go home before that because of the weather and because they weren't, and I don't know, maybe it was after December and they only signed up from July through no, this was September. The expedition was a failure. But in the end, it really didn't matter because on October 17th, 1777, a flag arrived at Newport from Providence with the news of the surrender of the British general and his army to the American forces. So all was not lost, but it was not a very good expedition for the Cape Cod militias there. Falmouth and Bedford are actually Falmouth and New Bedford. And Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors explains that it was called the alarms at Bedford and Falmouth, and they began on September 7th, 1778. You may remember from your history classes Major General Charles Gray's raid. It sounded vaguely familiar to me when I started looking it up. Under the pretense of relieving the British garrison at Newport, Gray conducted a series of raids on New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Martha's Vineyard. And this was for 2 weeks in September of 1778. First, he tried to destroy Bedford by setting it on fire. And he was partially successful, but the Fairhaven militia arrived to save the day the next day, so only partially successful. And then the militias from Cape Cod came, and they moved in to help, first at New Bedford and then at Fairhaven. And from there, they were going to move southeast to protect Falmouth. because the British were heading in that direction. But they avoided the fight at Falmouth and instead went to Martha's Vineyard. And General Grey, with impunity, took 10,000 head of sheep. That's all I know about Falmouth and Bedford. So, this is Captain Solomon Higgins. This is his military service. And you'll notice that it's the same as Cape Cod, because he was very, very involved in Eastham's military. He also did a couple of other things. And the handwriting on the far right, that is actually an application to the Sons of the American Revolution by Captain Higgins' great-grandson. And he had to prove his great-grandfather's military record in order to become a son of the American Revolution. And so this is where I was able to corroborate, getting this document off of Ancestry.com, that yes, he had been involved, as the Soldiers and Sailors book had told me, and other things. So it's kind of like a puzzle, or putting the pieces together, but that's what I enjoy. So the wreck of the Somerset. This is where the Truro and Eastham men show up again, specifically Truro in the beginning. According to the New England Historical Society's website, the Truro militia was, and this is a quotation, probably the smallest military unit to take one of the biggest prizes of the war. Now you know the Somerset, British man of war, phantom ship, whose masts and spars across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hull that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. You all had to learn Paul Revere's Ride, right? Some of you. My older sister and I still recite it to each other every April 18th. The 18th of April. Okay, in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. So unlike the secret expedition to Rhode Island, this time the militiamen had some help from Mother Nature, because a fierce nor'easter that killed several dozen Cape Codders also hurled the Somerset onto the dreaded shoals near what's now Highland Light. And we have a QR code for this exhibit so that visitors can connect digitally with this website, which goes on for pages and all kinds of links, and it's really wonderful. Suffice to say that it had 64 cannons, a crew of 480, including Royal Marines, and they all wrecked and came ashore, and the Truro militiamen captured them. And Truro and Eastham and other Cape militias marched all of those crew members to Boston. The officers got to go by ship, but the crew members were marched. And I'll share a diary entry that we found from an Eastham militiaman. He's a man of few words. He was 26 years old when he wrote this. November 10th, been to Plymouth with prisoners. Orders came last night for me to go today as far as Plymouth to guard the prisoners that were cast ashore in the late violent storm at the back of the Cape in the ship Somerset. Set out from home and got to Plymouth about daylight. Now my question is, how long did it take him to walk to Plymouth? Drove, I think he means driving like cattle, with 250 prisoners. There was in the whole about 450, besides about 30 who were drowned getting ashore. Ship mounted 64 guns. That's the whole entry for that incident of marching the prisoners to Plymouth. So I'll move on to another Revolutionary War character. This is Isaac Snow, who was born in Eastham to Elnathan and Phoebe Sparrow Snow, and who married Hannah Freeman, all of Eastham. He had helped to build the breastworks at Dorchester Heights with Solomon Higgins. Remember the Ticonderoga from that. And he also sailed on the schooner Resolution, but he was captured by the British and imprisoned in 1780. And this was in England, at the old mill prison in Plymouth, England, in 1781. And when he was released in 1783, he spent some time in France, quite a bit of time in France, becoming very friendly with some of the French people, and returned to Eastham after 8 years of service in the American Revolution, several of those years overseas. He was a very interesting character, and this is a collage by Albert E. Snow. He was an Eastham Orleans historian who researched and created collages of historical figures and events, and then he donated these to local historical societies, and we are so lucky. Every time I go into the archives and I go through a box of things and I look and I go, oh my gosh, this is from Al Snow. And you know it's well researched, and it's, I mean, he's just phenomenal. So Isaac Snow here is shown holding his autobiography, which he wrote of his adventures. And this is a daguerreotype by Orleans' first studio photographer. And his name was Captain George Henry Nickerson. He was a Union Army contemporary of the well-known Civil War photographer Matthew B. Brady. So Isaac Snow, besides his revolutionary pursuits, he's reputed to have ramrodded the naming of Eastham's South Precinct in 1797. He made sure that that was going to be called Orleans when it separated from Eastham. And some say it's because of his friendship with the Duke of Orleans in France after the war. At home, he was a coastal mariner, and then he built a mill known as the East Mill in Orleans. He became a grist miller, a cobbler, and at age 55, a drill instructor of 2 Orleans militia companies in the War of 1812. And that was defending Rock Inlet, which I'm sure is Rock Harbor. So when he died at the age of 97, he was Barnstable County's oldest and last Revolutionary War survivor. And if you want to know more about Isaac Snow, the Orleans Historical Society has several articles available online, and they're really interesting, and I'm sure they're in their museums also. So here's another 1812 Eastham. Now, I think it gets confusing because they were born in Eastham, but between the time they were born and died, Orleans, the South Precinct, separated from Eastham, and it was then known as Orleans. So when you try to go online and find these people and you know they were born in Eastham, it will say Orleans because they're going by older boundaries and not the boundary when they were born. So it's just one of the little things you have to kind of keep in mind in this time period. And the same with Wellfleet and Billingsgate. because they separated in 1767, I think. As long as they had a church and a minister, they could separate. So Joshua Crosby, also born in Eastham, in a place called Weesit. He died there also, but now it's Orleans. His parents were Joshua and Thankful Cole Crosby, and his wife was Sarah Freeman. Actually, his name is Captain Joshua Crosby III, and he's a 7th generation descendant of Eastham's second minister, Reverend Thomas Crosby. He served first in the U.S. merchant vessels during the war with Tripoli, and then he enlisted in the U.S. Navy for the War of 1812. And he served on board the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, and was a quarterdeck gun captain on that ship in the famous sea battle against the HMS Guerriere. I think that's how you pronounce that ship. In 1813, he joined Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry in the flagship Niagara, which had 20 guns, and they defeated the British at the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813. And then he rejoined the Constitution and was discharged in New York City in May 1814. And this collage, as you can guess, is also by Al Snow of Eastham, who made them all. After his war service, Joshua Crosby became the first keeper of the Three Sisters lighthouses in 1839, and he retired in 1855, and when he died in 1861, he was the last of the 1812 veterans to die in Barnstable County. So they were really quite long-lived, despite all of the adventures that they went through in these two wars. And then this is my title, The Incorrigible Hoppy Mayo. Captain Matthew Hoppy Mayo was born in 1779 to Thomas and Mary Crosby Mayo, and his wife was Rebecca Doane, and they were all from Eastham. He always had an adventure, and he was famous and infamous. So we have this story, the Green 1812 book that was published in 1906, I think. And then we have this 1912, sorry. And then we have Enoch Pratt's History of Eastham, Orleans, and Wellfleet that was published in 1844. And they both tell this story of Hoppy Mayo, as he was known, his nickname. And I love it. It's really long and complicated, but that's why we have a QR code. So if you come to the museum and put your phone on it, you get to read both of these at your leisure. And they're really interesting. I'll go straight through it. Captain Mayo and Captain Winslow L. Knowles, another Eastham man, went to Boston to sell rye on the black market. There was an embargo. You weren't allowed to travel or sell or things like that. They were captured by the British, taken on board the Spencer. And after a week or so, Captain Knowles was sent back to Boston to raise money for a ransom so that they would let them go free. But Mayo was kept on board the ship because he knew the waters of the Cape really, really well, and he was a very good sailor. So Knowles was convinced not to bother getting the ransom and not to return. So Hoppy, not knowing this, of course, but waiting and no word from his buddy, Captain Knowles, tricked the schooner captain into sailing to Billingsgate and then to Eastham. And it's really interesting and involves penknives and stolen little gold Derringer guns or something like that. But in the end, the main points are that he got the crew drunk, he disabled the rudder, he grounded the ship at low tide on the flats of Eastham. All the townspeople were on the shore looking at this big ship on the flats at the low tide. And they came running across and took all of the British prisoners. And then they marched them to Crosby's Tavern. They locked them in the barn. And they escaped back to their ship. And they sent a note demanding payment from the people of Eastham. and it goes on. And that brings me to the Civil War. So, for this war, we actually have photographs. And we have not only histories and first-hand accounts, but artifacts. And another of Jim Owen's lists of the sailors. Now, this also is not accurate. It's based on the 1862 draft, which was the first draft where soldiers were called up, and then there was another in 1863. But the gentleman in the lower right-hand corner of the photo is Atkins Higgins, and he's not on this list, which is alphabetical. I was very surprised until I found out the reason he's not on the list is that he volunteered in 1861 before the drafts, and so he wasn't counted. He's amazing. His parents were Andrew and Rebecca Atkins Higgins, and his wife was Althea Kershaw, but she was from Boston because he traveled. He traveled in the Civil War, and he met someone who was not from Eastham and married her. He was with the Company B of the U.S. Engineers. And this is a portrait of him, and this is the plaque on his grave at Evergreen Cemetery, which says August 21st, 1835 to October 27th, 1915. Service in the U.S. Engineer Corps, December 19th, 1861 to December 19th, 1864, for those 3 years. What's wonderful about him is that he created his own memory box of all of the articles that he took with him on his 20,000-mile marches throughout those 3 years. And we have them in our museum, along with the photographs that he had of people who, I don't think he took the photos, but they took the photos of him and of the battles and everything. So this is his display case in the museum. The memory box is right up next to the window on the left. It's hanging on the wall so that you can see it better. And then all of the photos that are around are photos that he provided, and all of the artifacts in this cabinet are its money and things like that. So I'm going to zoom in and show you some of the things that we have of his, and I'm sure that each one of them tells a story. So this is an aerial view on the left-hand side, and that says custom-made tin cup used for coffee pot, soup, dish, and drinking cup, 1861 to 1864. The tin all melted off. He had money. He had a sewing kit, and which he called his housewife and thimble. He had an inkstand, which he says traveled the 20,000 miles with him. He made a model boat from the wood of a pontoon bridge on the James River. I'm going to show you that pontoon bridge. Oh, and these are the buttons that he wore on his cap, the badge and the button that he found at the Battle of South Mountain. So this is the house, in the top corner is the house and wife and thimble, which says 3 years at the front. Over on the right-hand side, I said right, I meant left over there. The pontoon bridge across the James River, that does not look very sturdy. It's unbelievable. They're all on little pontoons. And I discovered that that's what a lot of the engineers did, were how to get across uncrossable rivers if you couldn't. This is a Civil War theatrical skit in the center, and the men obviously played the part of women. He has in that box, it wasn't a good photo, I couldn't get it. This is a knife that he used through the war, and then he changed it into a paper cutter when he got out of the war. All of these pins, it's a 3D, it's very hard to, you have to see it in person to really get it. He says A flat key from a southern house that they had to burn down, and he saved the A flat piano key. I think there's really a short story in here somewhere of all of the things that he saved. But that's it for today, for time's sake. He was an avid veteran. He stayed, he belonged to veterans associations. He belonged to the DAR. This is a 25th anniversary picture of his veteran U.S. engineers in 1886. And he's the second one from the right in the front row. And that brings us to the most recent displays we had for this past Veterans Day. So my dilemma in trying to find the words to honor our veterans was how to focus not only on their service, but our service to them and for them and in memory of them. And I said at the talk at the schoolhouse a couple weeks ago that the best way was through examples, and the best examples are visual. So this is the display board, two-sided. I have side-by-side that we put up in the museum as part of our, I'm going to zoom in on some of the items here and explain them. Except for one, and that's at the far right. You'll see a long list of names. It's 3 pages long, long and narrow. I could not get that to fit on a slide. And I'll explain it as I go through the other honor rolls, because we have many. Eastham had honor rolls for servicemen throughout the years. And these are the first 3 that I saw. The very first thing you see when you open up the annual town report in the years for 1943, 1944, and 1945. So the same names, lots of the same names, not all, are repeated through those 3 years. But they are Eastham's World War II veterans. And I liked how they called it an honor roll in that town report. So I took what they did and created my own from the lists that we do have. So we have the honor rolls for the Spanish-American War and World War I. And we have the honor roll for the Korean War and other conflicts at that time, and the honor roll for the Vietnam War. What we don't have is the honor roll for Eastham's current veterans, and that's that 3-page list that I showed you of 373 veterans who call Eastham home today and live here. And I'm just so blown away by that. Our tiny town has so many veterans. So here are just a few from the display. George Moore was born in Eastham and went to the Korean War in the Navy. And that's the only traveling he ever did. He came back to Eastham and stayed in Eastham until he passed away in 1999. And he's related to Catherine Moore, Morris Moore. His sister was Kate Moore, who was president of the Historical Society, quite well known. These other 4 soldiers are part of my family. My stepfather, Alfred Mills, my father, Marston Daley, my uncle, Robert Pearson, and my grandfather, Raymond Daley. And I post this every Memorial Day and every Veterans Day on my Facebook page, just because. This is Edwin Horton, Jr. Ed Horton, he took part in Doolittle's raid on Tokyo in 1942. So this is the group of flyers from Doolittle's raid. And this is Ed Horton when he was interviewed about that when he, a few years ago. This is another crew. This is the crew of Lieutenant Robert W. Sparrow. He is the second from the left in the back row. And this is the newspaper article when he went missing. He was on his 18th flight over Nazi territory in World War II. And he was Eastham's only action-related fatality in World War II. A friend of his who was in another plane saw his plane get shot out of the sky and wrote this note describing it. And another friend did the watercolor. I'm assuming it's a watercolor. And it's the demise of Little Lamsey Divey, which they named their plane. And there's a beautiful tribute to him in the museum. This is a silk panel used by airmen in the China-Burma Indian Theater in case they were shot down. It's made of silk because silk doesn't bleed, or water damage doesn't do much to it. And they would either have it folded in their pocket or sometimes on their sleeve or on the back of their flight jacket. And in 12 different languages, it says, "I am an American aviator. My plane has been destroyed. I am unable to speak your language. I am an enemy of the Japanese. have the kindness to protect me, feed me, and take me to the closest allied military office. The government of my country will reward you. And that was donated by the mother of one of these airmen. These are two men who I knew growing up. Grandpa Rongner, we called him, Ingwe Rongner, and his son George Rongner. They both served in the Coast Guard, and these are their medals that they had during their careers in the Coast Guard. Ingwe was stationed here during World War I and met his wife, Elsa Livingston, I think, from Orleans, and married her, and he built a house for $600 right down on Nauset Road here. And gave us many scrapbooks that he had kept through the years from Ingwe, and their medals. And this one is an Eastham family, 6 generations of service. And I have to read it because the veterans are my family. They're the Gills and the Daleys, and they're all so very close to my heart. This was my attempt to honor them, my grandfather, my father, my uncle, and especially my cousins and the Gills. They still live a stone's throw, literally, from me in the center of Eastham. So kind of in the middle, the round photo, is Roger Gill, who served on 2 tours in Vietnam. To his right is, to his right, to my left, is my father, Marston Daley. He was in the 8th Armored Tank Division in World War II, all over Europe. Raymond Daley, his father, my grandfather, was in World War I, served in England and in France. And Alfred Luther Gill was Roger's other grandfather, both of his grandfathers here, World War I. The funny thing is that Grandpa Freddie, his grandfather, Roger, and his son were all in the field artillery. And Nathan Gill, Jr., Civil War, was the uncle of Grandpa Freddie, Alfred Luther Gill. And then Roger's son joined the Army also in 1987. And his grandson, Colin, is now stationed in Hawaii on a submarine and serving there. So I just put this together for them for this Veterans Day. Veterans Day and Memorial Days, parades of veterans and in honor of veterans. On the left, the earliest known, this is the first time Eastham Elementary School students marched to the cemetery. Otto Nickerson made it a day that teachers and students would march. If you look carefully, the top one has the marching band in the very front, and then Otto Nickerson's bringing up the rear, and then they're going past what I think is the old town hall, right on the corner from the old schoolhouse, and this was 1931 to the cemetery. And the one on the right is for the tercentenary. Eastham had a huge parade in 1951 to celebrate 300 years, and these are the veterans who came home from the wars and marched, and they're marching by what is now Buddha Bob's. Was the old Esso station when I was growing up. And so to honor veterans and to talk about veterans, I'm going to turn the program over to Lou Andujar, if I've got this right about myself. And he'll tell you a little bit about himself and then creating the Veterans Memorial monument.
Thank you, Marca.
Sure.
That's incredible. To go back to history and how much we touch upon it nowadays. So many things that you said. It's unbelievable. Well, good afternoon. My name is Lou Andujar, and I come to Cape Cod by way of New Jersey and Connecticut. After attending the University of Bridgeport, I taught physical education and coached soccer and baseball, gymnastics, and I was a wrestling coach also. Because of Vietnam, I enlisted in the U.S. Army, going to officer candidate school and becoming a second lieutenant in the field artillery. Sounds familiar? I spent a year in Vietnam as an executive officer of an 8-inch, 175 artillery battery located in the Central Highlands. Upon returning home to my wife, we raised 2 boys in Connecticut, and in 2002, we retired to Cape Cod, where I've been involved with the American Legion, Disabled American Veterans, and the Eastham Veterans Memorial Committee. I also have to mention my wife is so much part of that committee, and definitely Denise in the back there. I have to thank the 2 of them for all the help they gave us in putting this memorial together. Establishing the Eastham Memorial Monument, the inspiration for that proposal of a Veterans Memorial goes back to my early days in New Jersey. We would honor and celebrate veterans on Memorial Day, on the 4th of July, on Armistice Day, as it was known in those days, now Veterans Day. And I remember seeing the soldiers in their uniforms and the marching by us, and I felt so very proud to be an American at that time. And I was only 8-10 years old. After my military service, Chester, Connecticut, the town we lived in, we established a memorial dedicated to the veterans from all the wars. When retiring to Eastham in 2002, there was minimal recognition of veterans. It became my mission to organize a committee to establish a place for a veteran monument to be, so we can recognize the veterans of all the wars of Eastham. A budget was approved at the Eastham town meeting to fund the project. Work commenced on October of 2022 on the site of the 1869 schoolhouse. The museum and the Historical Society granted us the piece of property to put that monument. And it was a granite memorial incorporated in the 7 branches of the services: the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Merchant Marines, the Coast Guard, and the new Space Force. And that was installed over a teardrop-shaped bluestone patio. A new flagpole and 2 teak benches were installed, and the dedication was held on Veterans Day of 2022, 150 days after the project was approved. Since Eastham is a Purple Heart community, Purple Heart recipients and families were honored at that dedication. That is all that I have to say but I want to thank you very much, Marca, how much the history that goes behind us incorporates, and really, that's where we are today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And as the Eastham Elementary School students do every year, it's a huge thank you to our veterans. And I just always have to show where my information comes from, the sources that I used, and also from the Council on Aging, the Eastham Historical Society, and the Eastham Veterans. we thank you for coming.